Hello, reading room. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm outside. It's a little cool outside. So I put on this wonderful little shawl that I have from my brand new daughter-in-law, although she's been around the family for a long time. She is now my daughter-in-law officially. And this was a gift from her. So I love it. I love it anyway. But we are talking about Ethics for a New Millennium by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We're on chapter number 6. And this actually starts with part 2, Ethics and the Individual. If you wanted to know what the name of part 1 was, as I do, there was the foundation of ethics. Okay? So, ethics and the individual. Chapter 6, the ethic of restraint. I have suggested that developing the compassion on which happiness depends demands a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need to restrain those factors which inhibit compassion. On the other, we need to cultivate those which are conducive to it, which is what I try to do in my positive psychology class and in our DIY psychologist, in all my classrooms. As we have seen, what is conducive to compassion is love, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, humility, and so on. What inhibits compassion is the lack of inner restraint, which we have identified as the source of all unethical conduct. We find that by transforming our habits and dispositions, we can begin to perfect our overall state of heart and mind, kung long, that from which all our actions spring. So inner restraint, self-control. The first thing then, because the spiritual qualities conducive to compassion entail positive ethical conduct, it is to cultivate a habit of inner discipline. Now, I cannot deny that this is a major undertaking, but at least we are familiar with the principle. For example, knowing its destructive potential, we restrain both ourselves and our children from indulging in drug abuse. However, it is important to recognize that restraining our response to negative thoughts and emotions is not a matter of just suppressing them. Insight into their destructive nature is crucial. Merely being told that envy, potentially a very powerful and destructive emotion, is negative cannot provide a strong defense against it. If we order our lives externally but ignore the inner dimension, inevitably we will find that doubt, anxiety, and other afflictions develop, and happiness eludes us. This is because, unlike physical discipline, true inner or spiritual discipline cannot be achieved by force, but only through voluntary and deliberate effort based on understanding. In other words, conducting ourselves ethically consists in more than merely obeying laws and precepts. The undisciplined mind is like an elephant. If left to blunder around out of control, it will wreak havoc. But the harm and suffering we encounter as a result of failing to restrain the negative impulses of mind far exceed the damage a rampaging elephant can cause. Not only are these impulses capable of bringing about the destruction of things, they can also be the cause of lasting pain to others and to ourselves. And by the way, the kind of impulses and self-control that he's talking about, you can't turn it on and off. By this, I do not mean to suggest that the mind, lo, is inherently destructive. Under the influence of a strongly negative thought or emotion, the mind may seem to be characterized by a single quality. But if, for instance, hatefulness were an unchangeable characteristic of consciousness, then consciousness must always be hateful. Clearly, this is not the case. There is an important distinction to be made between consciousness as such and the thoughts and emotions it experiences. Similarly, while at the time a powerful experience may overwhelm us, when we consider it later, we are unmoved. When very young, I used to become highly excited as the old year drew to a close and the thought of Manlam Kenmo This was the great prayer festival which marked the start of the Tibetan New Year. In my capacity as Dalai Lama, I had an important role in this, which meant moving from the Potala to a set of rooms in the Jokhang Temple, one of Tibet's holiest shrines. As the day drew closer, I would spend more and more time daydreaming at the prospect, half terrified and half elated, and less time studying. My feelings of terror were caused by the thought of the long recital I had to give from memory during the main ceremony, my excitement by the thought of passing among the huge crowd of pilgrims and traders thronging the marketplace in front of the temple complex. Even though both the overexcitement and the aversion I felt were real enough then, today, of course, I can laugh at these memories. I am now quite used to crowds, and after so many years of practice, the recitation no longer troubles me. We can conceive the nature of mind in terms of the water in a lake. When the water is stirred up by a storm, the mud from the lake's bottom clouds it, making it appear opaque. But the nature of the water is not dirty. When the storm passes, the mud settles and the water is left clear once again. So although generally we may suppose mind or consciousness to be an inherent and unchangeable entity, when we consider it more deeply, we see that it consists in a whole spectrum of events and experiences. These include our sensory perception, which engages with objects directly, as well as our thoughts and feelings, which are mediated by language and concepts. It is also dynamic through deliberate engagement. We can affect changes in our mental and emotional states. We know, for example, how comfort and reassurance can help dispel fear. Similarly, those forms of counseling which lead to greater awareness and affection can help alleviate depression. This observation that emotion and consciousness are not the same thing tells us that we do not have to be controlled by our thoughts and emotions. Prior to our every action, the president or monarch who is very honest, very pure. In this view, our thoughts and emotions are like cabinet ministers. Some of them give good advice, some bad. Others only their own narrow interests. The responsibility of the main consciousness, the leader, is to determine which of these subordinates gives good advice and which bad, which of them are reliable and which are not, and to act on the advice of the one sort and not the other. Discernment, early birds. Mental and emotional events which in this sense give bad advice can themselves be described as a form of suffering. Indeed, we find that when they are allowed to develop to any significant degree, the mind becomes swamped with emotion and we experience a kind of inner turbulence. That, again, was bad advice, like the bad advice from COVID, for example, right? Lots of bad advice. We find that when they're allowed to develop bad advice to any significant degree, the mind becomes swamped with emotion and we experience a kind of inner turbulence. Exactly that. This also has a physical dimension. In a moment of anger, for example, we experience a powerful disturbance of our habitual equilibrium, which can often be sensed by others. We are all familiar with the way in which the whole atmosphere is spoiled when just one member of the household is in a bad mood. When we become enraged, both people and animals tend to avoid us. Sometimes this turbulence is so strong that we find great difficulty containing it. This can cause us to lash out at others. In doing so, we externalize our inner turbulence. This is not to say that all thoughts and emotions which cause us discomfort are necessarily negative. Again, that's externalizing. When we say externalizing behavior in psychology, that men tend to externalize their behaviors, women tend to internalize their behaviors, that's what they mean. That we externalizing their inner turbulence, okay? When you lash out, okay? The primary attribute that distinguishes ordinary emotions from those which undermine peace is its negative cognitive component. A moment of sorrow does not become disabling grief unless we hold on to it and add negative thoughts and imaginings. In the case both of the overexcitement I felt about those crowds of pilgrims and traders and the fear I had of the long recitation, there was an added cognitive component on top of the basic feeling. Through my somewhat obsessive daydreaming, my imagination superimposed something beyond the reality of the situation. And it was the stories I told myself about the forthcoming event that undermined my basic serenity. So he keeps going back to the imagination. Nor is all fear like the childish one I have just described. There are occasions when we experience a more rational kind of fear. Far from being negative, this may actually be helpful. It can heighten our awareness and give us the energy we need to protect ourselves. On the first night of my escape from Lhasa in 1959, when I left home dressed as a soldier, I certainly felt this kind of fear. But because I had neither the time nor the inclination to think about it, it did not unsettle me very much. Its main effect was to make me very alert. One could say that this was an instance of fear which was both justified and useful. The fear we feel in relation to a situation which is quite delicate or critical may also be justified. Here I am thinking of what we feel when we have to make a decision we know will have a significant impact on others' lives. Such fear may disconcert us somewhat. Not the pharmaceutical companies, apparently. But the most dangerous and negative is that fear which is completely unreasonable and which can totally overwhelm and paralyze us. In Tibetan, we call such negative and emotional events nyangmang, literally that which afflicts from within, or as the term is usually translated, afflictive emotion. On this way, generally speaking, all those thoughts, emotions, and mental events which reflect a negative or uncompassionate state of mind, kung long, inevitably undermine our experience of inner peace. All negative thoughts and emotions, such as hatred, anger, pride, lust, greed, envy, and so on, are considered to be afflictions in this sense. We find that these afflictive emotions are so strong that if we do nothing to counter them, though there is no one who does not value their life, they can lead us to the point of madness and even suicide itself. But because such extremes are unusual, we tend to see negative emotions as an integral part of our mind about which we can do very little. And in failing to recognize their destructive potential, we do not see the need to challenge them. Indeed, far from doing so, we have a tendency to nurture and reinforce them. January 6th. This provides them the ground in which to grow. Yet, as we shall see, their nature is wholly destructive. January 6th. They are the very source of unethical conduct. January 6th. They are also the basis of anxiety, depression, confusion, and stress, which are such a feature of our lives today. Negative thoughts and emotions are what obstruct our most basic aspiration, to be happy and to avoid suffering. When we act under their influence, we become oblivious to the impact our actions have on others. They are thus the cause of our destructive behavior, both toward others and to ourselves. Murder, scandal, and deceit all have their origin in afflictive emotion. This is why I say that the undisciplined mind, that is, the mind under the influence of anger, hatred, greed, pride, selfishness, and so on, is the source of all our troubles, which do not fall into the category of unavoidable suffering, sickness, old age, death, and so on. Our failure to check our response to the afflictive emotions opens the door to suffering for both self and others. To say that when we cause others to suffer, we ourselves suffer does not, of course, mean that we can logically infer that in every instance when, for example, I hit someone, I will be hit myself. The proposition I am making is much more general than this. Rather, I mean to suggest that the impact of our actions, both positive and negative, registers deep within us. If it is correct that on some level we all have the capacity for empathy, it follows that for one individual to harm another, this potential must be overwhelmed or submerged in some other way. Take the case of a person who cruelly tortures another. Their mind, must be strongly gripped at the gross or conscious level by some kind of harmful thinking or ideology which causes them to believe their victim is deserving of such treatment. Such a belief, which to some degree must have been deliberately chosen, is what enables the cruel person to suppress their feelings, their beliefs, their rationale. And some of it's just about money, by the way. Nevertheless, deep down, there is bound to be some kind of effect. In the long run, there is a high degree of probability that discomfort will be felt by the torturer. Consider in this context the example we looked at earlier of merciless dictators like Hitler and Stalin. It seems that as they neared the end of their lives, they became lonely, anxious, full of dread and suspicion, like crows afraid of their own shadow. Is that true, right? Is that true? So the discomfort will be felt by the torturer. The more distance we put between the tortured and the torturer, corporation, money, that distance themselves from the hurt, the less the consequences I believe we feel. Of course, the number of people who go to such extremes is very small. Not anymore. The impact of minor negative actions is also much more subtle than major ones. So, as a less extreme example of the way in which negative actions cause suffering both to ourselves as well as others, consider a child going out to play who gets into a fight with another child. Immediately after, the victorious child may experience a sense of satisfaction, but on returning home, that emotion will subside and a more subtle state of mind will manifest. At that point, a sense of unease sets in. We could almost describe this sort of feeling as a sense of alienation from self. The individual doesn't feel quite right. In the contrary case of a child who goes out to play and shares an enjoyable afternoon with the friend, afterwards, not only will there be an immediate sense of satisfaction, but when the mind has settled down and the excitement worn off, there will be a sense of calm and comfort. Another example of the way in which negative actions harm the one who indulges them can be seen in the context of an individual's reputation. Generally, it seems we humans, even for that matter, animals, abhor meanness, aggressiveness, deceit, and so on. To me, this suggests that if we engage in activities which harm others, despite the temporary satisfaction we might gain thereby, people will at some point begin to look at us askance. They will become like this. They will become apprehensive of us, nervous and suspicious on account of our bad reputation. In time, we will start to lose friends. In this way, because a good reputation is a source of happiness, we bring suffering on ourselves if we spoil it. Indeed, though there may be a few exceptions, we find that if a person lives a very selfish life without concern for others' welfare, they tend to become quite lonely and miserable. Though they may be surrounded by people who are friends of their wealth or status, when the selfish or aggressive individual faces tragedy, not only do these so-called friends vanish, they may even secretly rejoice. And if, moreover, he or she is actively malicious, it is likely that when they die, they are not much missed. People may actually be glad, as many of the inmates of the Nazi death camps must have been at the subsequent execution of their captors. Conversely, we find that when people are actively concerned for others, they are much respected, even venerated. When such people die, many mourn and regret their passing. Consider the case of Mahatma Gandhi. Despite a Western education and despite the opportunities this gave him to lead a comfortable life, he chose out of consideration for others to live in India almost as a beggar in order to devote himself to his life's work. Yet though his name is now just a memory, millions still draw comfort and inspiration from his noble deeds. As far as the actual cause of afflictive emotion is concerned, we can point to a number of different factors. These include the habit we all have of thinking of ourselves before others. We can also cite our tendency to project characteristics onto things and events above and beyond what actually is there, as in the example of mistaking the coiled rope for a snake. Personification is what that's called. But beyond these, because our negative thoughts and emotions do not exist independently of other phenomena, the very objects and events we come into contact with play a role in shaping our responses. There is thus nothing which does not have the potential to trigger them. Anything can be a source of afflictive emotion, not just adversaries, but our friends and our most valued possessions too, even our own selves. This suggests that the first step in the process of actually countering our negative thoughts and emotions is to avoid those situations and activities which would normally give rise to them. For example, we find or we become angry whenever we meet with a particular person. It may be best to keep away from them until we develop our internal resources more. The second step is to avoid the actual conditions which lead to these strong thoughts and emotions. Oh gosh, never mind. I'll get it. This, however, presupposes that we have learned to recognize afflictive emotions as they arise in us. This is not always easy. While hatred is a very strong emotion when fully developed, in its beginning stages, the aversion we feel toward a particular object or event may be quite subtle. And even at their most advanced stages in development, afflictive emotions do not always manifest dramatically. The assassin may be relatively calm in the moment that he pulls the trigger. To this end, we need to pay close attention and be aware of our body and its actions, of our speech and what we say, and of our hearts and minds and what we think and feel, which we are unable to do when we are drugged with these healthcare cartel drugs. We must be on the lookout for the slightest negativity and keep asking ourselves such questions as, am I happier when my thoughts and emotions are negative and destructive, or when they are wholesome? What is the nature of consciousness? Does it exist in and of itself, or does it exist in dependence on other factors? We need to think. We should be like a scientist who collects data, analyzes it, and draws the appropriate conclusion. Gaining insight into our own negativity is a lifelong task, and one which is capable of almost infinite refinement. But unless we undertake it, we will be unable to see where to make the necessary changes in our lives. Were we to expend even a fraction of the time and effort we consume in trivial activities, pointless gossip, and the like, on gaining insight into the actual nature of afflictive emotion, I believe it would have a huge impact on our quality of life. Sirens, they don't do anything. Whatever. I believe it would have a huge impact on our quality of life. Both individuals and society would benefit. One of the first things we would discover is how destructive afflictive emotions are. And the more we develop an appreciation of their destructive nature, the more disinclined we would become to follow them, unless we have a whole pharmaceutical industry that's benefiting from it. This alone, and by the way, a political system, or at least an economic system, this alone would have a significant impact on our lives. Consider that not only do negative thoughts and emotions destroy our experience of peace, they also undermine our health. In the Tibetan medical system, anger is a primary source of many illnesses, including those associated with high blood pressure, sleeplessness, and degenerative disorders, a view which seems increasingly accepted in allopathic medicine and unaccepted in Western medicine. Another childhood memory illustrates the way in which afflictive emotions harm us. When I was a teenager, one of my favorite pastimes was tinkering with the old cars that my predecessor, the 13th Dalai Lama, had acquired not so long before he died in 1933. There were 4 of them, 2 baby Austins of British manufacture, a Dodge, and a beat-up Jeep, both of American origin. Together they comprised almost the only powered vehicles in Tibet. For the young Dalai Lama, these dusty relics held an irresistible attraction, and I longed to have them running again. My secret dream was actually to learn to drive, but it was only after a lot of pestering of various government officials that finally I found someone who knew anything about cars. This was Latka Tirsing, who came from Kalimpong, a town just over the Indian border. One day I recall he was working on the engine of one of the cars when, dropping his spanner, he shouted an oath and stood up abruptly. Unfortunately, I had forgotten the hood above him, and he hit his head with a terrible crack. But then, to my great surprise, instead of extracting himself carefully, he became further enraged and, straightening up again, hit his head even harder a second time. For a moment I stood astonished at these antics. Then I found I could not stop laughing. Lakpa Searing's outburst resulted in nothing more than 2 generous bruises. That was merely unfortunate for him. But from this, we see how the afflictive emotions destroy one of the most precious qualities, namely our capacity for discriminative awareness, robbed of what enables us to judge between right and wrong, to evaluate what is likely to be of lasting benefit and what of merely temporary benefit to self and others, and to discern the likely outcome of our actions. We are no better off than animals. Small wonder that under their influence we do what ordinarily we would never consider doing. This obliteration of our critical faculties points to another negative characteristic of this type of mental and emotional event. Afflictive emotions deceive us. They seem to offer satisfaction, but they do not provide it. In fact, although such emotions come to us in the guise of a protector, giving us, as it were, boldness and strength, we find that this energy is essentially blind. Decisions taken under its influence are often a source of regret. More often than not, such anger is actually an indication of weakness rather than strength. Most people have experienced an argument deteriorating to the point where one person becomes verbally abusive, a clear sign of the fragility of their position. Moreover, we do not need anger to develop courage and confidence, as we shall see. It can be done through other means. All right, it looks like chapter 6 goes on, so we've got longer chapters now. It's a few pages longer, but I'm stopping there. And so we are going to get into days instead of chapters, unless chapter 7 happens to be a short chapter. No, we've got longer chapters now. So we're going back to days. So I'm working days now. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are reading Ethics for a New Millennium, which came out in 1999, right? And it was written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We will continue chapter 6 tomorrow, because we've already been here for half an hour, for Pete's sake. Thanks for joining me here in the classroom. Specifically, thanks for joining me here in the reading room.